Okay, hello. Welcome to our first philosophy colloquium of spring quarter. And speaking to us today is Justin E.H. Smith. Hold on a second. Here's his website. As you can see, he's written a number of books. He's a Leibniz scholar, I guess, so to speak, originally. So his first book,
I like to think I still am one.
Yeah, I mean it, but I mean it's your specialty of origin.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So his first book was about Leibniz. The second book is about race and early modern philosophy, and since then he's branched out into some broader things. Right. So he has this book about the philosopher or history in six types, and then his most recent book is about irrationality. You can see from the main thing here that he's branched out rather farther than that. And he's also written a large number of academic papers, and also I guess, although I believe, Justin, you're not completely comfortable with this title, but this what we nowadays call a public philosopher. He's written, including for the New York Times and various magazines and so forth. And he's also had a well-read blog, which is now sort of morphed into this Substack newsletter. So if you're interested, you can subscribe to that. And I guess I should just say on a personal note, and it's kind of ironic given the content of this talk, which is that I've known Justin for, I don't know, quite a few years now, but we've barely ever met in person. And we first met on Facebook. I don't think I would know him if it weren't for Facebook. So that's an interesting note to this talk. Um, all right, and the title of his talk today is Whatever Manifests Itself Has the Shape of an Eye, an argument about attention and empathy. So please join me in welcoming Justin E.H. Smith.
Hey, thank you so much, Abe. And thanks so much for having me. I did see Abe in the flesh the first time. It's been more than once, but the first time was visiting UC Santa Cruz for a conference maybe 8 or 9 years ago that you organized on things. So we're not there yet. All right, so I'm delighted to know that some of you have read this paper already. I'm going to mostly be reading it myself because it is a prepared text, and I think that's the best way for me to present it. There also will be a PowerPoint presentation, and I will try to also contextualize the work a bit for you in a way that was not necessarily evident in when you were simply reading the text. So recently, just last month, I was a co-organizer of a workshop that was within the History of Science program at Princeton. That brought together people from a number of different disciplines, but mostly from history departments, philosophy departments, anthropology, media studies. Some philosophers whose names you might know, including Jesse Prince and Carolyn Dicey Jennings, were involved, and I was involved as well. The purpose of this meeting, though, was for all of us, each coming from our respective academic backgrounds, to find some common ground with one another on which to speak about a matter that is on everyone's mind. So if this paper has a quality of kind of bleeding out of the bounds of philosophy, both in its discursive style and in the range of topics it touches on. That's because of the point of its origin, but I thought I would continue to circulate it at least a few more times, because we will be publishing a volume out of this workshop, and I want to make the paper better. And the best way I can do that is to share it with other philosophers. So again, I'm just going to read, and I will. I suspect I will go until about 5 after the hour, if my earlier synchronization holds up. All right. So scholarly advances in the study of attention in recent decades have coincided with the technological and economic revolution of epoch-making importance. The long-term consequences of this revolution for human thriving are not yet known, but the prognosis does not look good. For one thing, the largest industry in the world now is quite literally an attention-seeking industry. The great economic engine of the internet is fed on countless nibbles of individual human attention, and it must constantly solicit such attention if it is to get fed. Those who own its principal sites of social engagement have discovered, moreover, that the internet is much better able to indulge its voracious appetite when it appeals to human passion rather than to human reason, when it entices our first order desire for dopamine-fueled gratification rather than inviting us to cultivate moral character or to pursue long-term goals of betterment of self or world. These are only some of the concerns in light of which many today speak of a general crisis of attention. Parents complain of the difficulty of limiting their children's screen time. The pharmaceutical industry develops new drugs and new avenues of profit in the fight against ADHD. Startups sell special brain scanning goggles that shock students back into focus when their attention begins to flag, such as the attentive U glasses. People of all ages complain that they are no longer able to read a book from cover to cover, or even to watch a movie without slipping away to Google the actors. The crisis is real and many tentative. Yet while there has been much hand-wringing and at least some serious critique treating of the crisis, there has been rather less sustained philosophical inquiry into what exactly is being critically threatened by the crisis of attention. One popular representation of the problem launders the bit of folk wisdom according to which there is poverty in riches. As James Williams argues in the influential 2018 book, Stand Out of Our Light, information abundance produces attention scarcity. That's a quote. This, however, seems to get wrong both the nature of the mental faculty in question and the condition of the milieu in which that faculty finds itself. There are, after all, infinite potential solicitations upon the faculty of attention in any rainforest or even in any desert. Yet indigenous peoples have generally inhabited these natural environments without experiencing a crisis of attention. Although I am myself very interested in the cognitive anthropology of information processing in natural environments, maybe we can discuss that some in the discussion period, I'd like to bracket that question in order to focus on the claim of attention scarcity in our own information environment. Even if we acknowledge we are operating within the domain of metaphor, it seems a mistake to speak of attention as subject to scarcity. For unlike fossil fuels, and much like love, attention is capable of automatically replenishing itself from moment to moment. This is good news for those who gain from the new economy of attention extraction. As long as there are human beings, the profiteers will never run out of the sweet stuff thereafter. But if we are to stand any chance of putting up a viable resistance to the extraction economy, then it would be well to understand, to the extent possible without reliance on metaphor, the nature of the mental faculty in crisis, and in turn to bring to bear the results of this philosophical inquiry within the ever more urgent public debate about our current technological predicament and how to manage it. Thus, in this talk, I would like to begin to bridge the divide between the treatment of attention within the philosophy of mind and related fields on the one hand, and on the other, the social and political problems that preoccupy many of us, both within philosophy and beyond. The gravity of the crisis of attention by the apparent fact is compounded by the apparent fact that what is at issue is not just the health of a single mental faculty, but indeed some fear the integrity of the self itself. Dispersal into digital channels and digitally mediated interpersonal connections is often described, both by scholars and in popular culture, as threatening to fracture or dissolve the unity of self through sundry avatars, screens, or layers of presentation. From recent literary treatments, such as Lauren Euler's new novel, Fake Accounts, to the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler's work on technology and madness in the age of computational capitalism, there's a widely attested concern either that the self is under serious threat in the present historical moment, or at least that the self needs urgently to be rethought. If philosophy is to help resolve the challenge facing the faculty of attention and the self in our new technological landscape, it will do well, first of all, to clarify the relationship between these two common notions. In fact, working out this relationship, as well as the relationship of both of these to consciousness and to volition, has been one of the principal driving forces in the subdomain of the philosophy of mind, concerned with attention in recent years. So next, I would like to survey two representative accounts of attention in recent philosophy of mind, with an eye to understanding in particular the importance of the account of attention for understanding the related problem of the self. I will give a brief account of the recent work of Carolyn Dicey Jennings, who believes that attention to attention leads us to a rigorous commitment to its sources in a subject, and will then turn to the work of Janardhan Ganeri, who argues the reverse. While I will express a decided preference for the latter's views, I will also seek to draw out and develop what I see as some neglected points in Ganeri's own work. In particular, I want to argue that empathy, which Ganeri sees as an instance of attention alongside others, might best be elevated to the status of an exemplary or paradigmatic instance, attention to the specifics of which will yield insight into the general problem and operations of attention. In developing this account, moreover, I'll have a good deal to say about examples drawn from art and insights drawn from the history of aesthetic theory. Once I've developed this original account, I will return with a critical eye to the problem of the crisis of attention in our current technological moment. So I take Dicey Jennings' 2020 book, The Attending Mind, to be both a fine representative of the state of the field of philosophy of attention, as well as marking out an interesting new direction for its further development, even as I disagree with some of her most basic conclusions. Much previous scholarship, at least if we confine ourselves to the Anglophone sphere and to the most recent decades, has been principally concerned to give us an account of what attention is like. Dicey Jennings sets herself the very different task of explaining attention in relation to its source. For her, that source is a subject or self, which she understands as a source of change, and thus as bearing causal power. We experience being a source of change, she writes, when we make an effort to change our behavior. Dicey Jennings acknowledges that this experience may well be illusory, and for this reason, she maintains, we should also draw on what she takes as secondary and tertiary evidence, namely and respectively, the tools developed in experimental contexts to identify the so-called active and passive behavior of subjects, as well as evidence from studies of the brain for neural states corresponding to a subject's reported effort. Thus, phenomenology, experimental psychology, and neuroscience, she argues, furnish three mutually corroborating types of evidence for a subject lying behind acts of attention. On her most succinct definition, attention is an act of mental prioritization by a subject, essential for perception, but not for consciousness or action. And here she's positioning herself in kind of a standard checklist of the philosophy of attention. The subject for Dicey Jennings is the one who, quote, pulls the bow, to use a metaphor that draws on the etymology of attention in the verb tendo, whose primary meaning derives from archery. In the account Dicey Jennings positions herself against, in her account, Dicey Jennings positions herself against what she takes to be the predominant theory of attention as selection from limitation, which she identifies in philosophers from St. Augustine, who contrasts our human inability to process everything at once with the omniscience of God, all the way to Min-Shik Kim and Kyle Cave, for whom at any given moment, the visual system receives more information than it can fully process. Thus, some portion of the visual input must be selected and processed more carefully than the rest. So, attention as selection. While arguing that attention reveals its own causal sources in the subject itself, Dicey Jennings aims to avoid what she calls the homunculus fallacy. For her, the self evidenced by attention is not a Cartesian metaphysical subject, but is rather brain-based and emergent. That is to say that hers is an account that remains faithful to naturalism, even if it revives a very familiar entity of non-naturalist accounts. Yet if it is brain-based and emergent, it is not entirely clear to me why Dicey Jennings should not seek an explanation of attention that analyzes it further back than the stage at which the self appears. As after all, if the self is emergent, then it emerges from a level of organization at which no self can be found. And if it is brain-based, then presumably also the brain, which is a composite entity par excellence, can be analyzed down to further constituent elements that explain its role as a basis of selfhood. In the end, Dicey Jennings' account rests satisfied with, I will not say a conflation, but a stipulative equivalency between selfhood and the experience of being a locus of causal power through attention. Other options present themselves. One attractive alternative, compellingly pursued by Janardhan Ganeri in his 2017 book, Attention Not Self, seeks to revive a distinguished line of inquiry from classical Theravada Buddhist thought, most notably as represented by the 5th century philosopher Buddhaghosa. Michael Dummett once remarked that the philosophy of mind is perhaps the most promising domain of philosophy in which to put different traditions, widely dispersed in history and geography, into conversation with one another. And Ganeri's work well illustrates this suggestion. By the way, Buddhaghosa is the one standing and delivering the probably banana leaf papers on which his texts are written to the emperor. The guy sitting is the emperor, not the philosopher. For Ganeri, attention is an action which may be conscious or unconscious. It is attention that explains our active involvement with the world, what he calls our freedom from passivity. But he rejects what he calls the authorship, one element of which is the causal theory of action, according to which an event is an action just in case it is caused by rationalizing intention, which in turn is the result of an agent's motivating beliefs and desires. For him, rather, according to the attentionalist view, being at the center of an organized arena of experience and action is a property not of a real, but at best of a virtual entity, which as such cannot have any causal powers. So the self cannot be an agent. This is Ganeri's redux of Buddhaghosa's elaboration of the Pali notion of anatta. And Buddhaghosa writes in Pali, which is somewhat demotic kind of descendant of Sanskrit, comparable to, say, Italian's relationship to Latin, roughly. And I try to give you both the Pali and the Sanskrit. So this is Ganeri's redux of Buddhaghosa's elaboration of the Pali notion of anatta, equivalent to the Sanskrit anatman or no self. The arena of experience Ganeri describes is in turn his gloss on the Pali chitta, the same word in Sanskrit. This term might best be translated as frame. And in Buddhaghosa's theory, it is precisely attention that provides the frame of experience and agency, rather than attention being a space of awareness distinct from and occupied by experience of awareness and agency. Like Dicey Jennings, and like nearly all contemporary philosophers, Ganeri seeks to assure us that his account of attention is not just compatible with, but indeed recommended by naturalism. He sees in his own Theravada-inflected attentionalism an echo of Kit Fine's fragmentalist naturalism, according to which reality is neither wholly relative to a perspective, nor is it all of a piece. Ganeri also believes he avoids the snare of impersonalism that lies at the heart of much representative work in Mahayana Buddhism. For example, the shunyata, or emptiness, of Madhyamaka, or middle path philosophy. Admittedly, something of a misnomer to call it a middle path, according to which, quote, all things are empty of intrinsic existence and nature. That's Ganeri's gloss on middle path philosophy. For Ganeri, the account of attention as the ongoing structuring of experience and agency provides a key for the interpretation of numerous satellite notions, such as mindfulness, a kind of rehearsing or retentive attention, and empathy, attention through embodied comportment to the feelings, commitments, and wishes of others. Nor does this latter experience, empathy, characterized by the second person encounter with what is often conceptualized as another self, compel or even militate in favor of a more robust model of the self, either one's own self or that of another. Since all that is implied by an empathetic encounter, on Ganeri's account, is recognition of the presence of another structuring frame of attention of, as it were, similar make and model. So I'll have at least a few remarks on mindfulness further on. For now, it's worth dwelling at some length on empathy as a pillar in the construction of the bridge that will eventually bring us back to the question of attention and self in the digital era. At a basic level, it's plain that the notion of attention is dense with connotations of moral investment that other more purely cognitive notions, such as consciousness, plainly lack. Thus, one might plead with a loved one, pay attention to. It's also evident in the word's most common verbal form, to attend, which can mean either to show up where one is expected or to serve someone in a devoted fashion, not to mention the French cognate attendre, to wait, a term that is not overtly moral, but that in common usage implies a sense of duty. You must wait, you should wait. Empathy, likewise, conveys the idea of such moral investment, yet it's a late arrival on the scene, a retrofitting of Greek word roots for an English calque of a German neologism, Einführung, coined only in the 19th century and attributed variously to Hermann Lotze and to Robert Fischer, also found in earlier variant forms in Herder. Guarneri nonetheless feels justified in using the English term empathy to render two Pali words often employed by Buddhaghosa, karana, most commonly translated as compassion, and metta, or kindness. Yet it's worth dwelling on the particularities and possible sources of the notion of empathy in 19th century German aesthetic theory, rather than running it together with other partially overlapping notions from either classical India or contemporary moral psychology. Intriguingly, Robert Fischer's use of the term, developing some themes found in his father, Christian Theodor Fischer's aesthetic theory, describes not so much interpersonal or second-person encounters, at least not in our ordinary restrictive sense, but rather the aesthetic relation that a person can have with an object, a work of art, or the world around her. Fischer-Père develops this idea in his remarkable 1879 novel, Auch einer, so translates as like yet another, or another one, another guy, in connection with an idea of architectural form, not as something that is simply observed, but rather as something that is in harmony or disharmony with the state of the spirit of the people who inhabit built environments. In a playful vein, the novelist describes his peculiar, somewhat panpsychist vision of die Tücke des Objekts, the spite of the object. And this is interestingly connected to a theory that is often described as tongue-in-cheek. I don't know why, it seems like a perfectly plausible theory to me. It's found in a number of 19th century authors under the name of resistentialism. And the view holds something like the reason why the world strikes us as impenetrable or heavy, or why we stub our toes against the ground and so on, is because the world hates us and is angry at us and actively spiteful towards us. Something like that. It's an interesting theory. Maybe we can talk about it a bit in the discussion. So at one point, Fischer's protagonist in the in the novel, describes, and I quote, the general tendentiousness, indeed animosity of the object, of the so-called body, which until now physics has spiritlessly identified with names like the law of gravity, statics, and the like, while it is much rather to be derived from the inhabitation of malevolent spirits. Now, this account of the derivation of corporeal properties from spiritual activity is familiar from a number of early modern philosophers, not least Leibniz. In the end, Leibniz believes that impenetrability is the consequence of a variety of perception. Though Leibniz, rather than seeing this activity as a mirror, Fischer, rather than seeing this activity as a mirror of divine goodness, as Leibniz does, sees it as having quite the reverse moral valence. So it's important to bear in mind that both Lotze and the Fischers, in their respective theories of Einfühlung, are fully immersed in a broadly Leibnizian philosophical worldview in which there are no objects that are fully denuded of subjecthood, and in which the object-like properties that we perceive in the external world, impenetrability, extension, and so on, are in fact phenomenal consequences of the perceptual activity of other subjects. This is, of course, very different from anything Buddhaghosa holds, since, as we've seen, his concern is to eliminate subjects from the account of all forms of attention, including what we're translating as empathy. But it at least suggests that if we are going to admit empathy, as Ganeri wishes to do, as one dimension of a broader theory of attention, then we should at least acknowledge, first of all, that historically empathy emerges in connection with accounts of our attentive encounters, not with other people, but rather with at least certain kinds of objects, or perhaps even any object attended to with the right disposition. And second of all, we should remember that attention to this link to the history of aesthetic theory may yield up significant resources for philosophers seeking to elaborate an account of attention. I'm not alone in noticing this. In recent work, Jesse Prince has sought to elaborate how the study of particular artistic traditions can expand our battery of tools in the philosophy of attention, dwelling as a particularly rich case study on the use of negative space in Japanese painting. This one is particularly entrancing in my view. But I'd like to move to a more mundane level and suggest that similar insights may be drawn from attention to found objects, whether transfigured in the manner of Duchamp or Warhol, or simply picked up off the desk as an inkpot or a letter opener or a mouse pad. If someone says that they are conscious or aware of a mouse pad on the desk, it's generally safe to say that that person is not in the process of discovering new things about that mouse pad. But if they tell you that they have gone to the museum and attended to a work of art, this language sounds precious, but we still understand what it means. You're thereby made to know that they have undertaken a concrete exercise, which, like all exercise, has a different character at the end than at the beginning. What the turn to the history of aesthetics suggests is that determination of whether a theory of attention must trace back to an attending subject may be the wrong question to pursue. One might do better to think of attention to objects as an elevation of them into a sort of intersubjective relationship, however temporary. We may or may not wish to presume a subject behind our own acts of attention, and almost nobody today, Pace Leibniz, would want to presume a subject, something analogous to le moi, as he says, lying behind the phenomenal presentations of objects. But in the end, our differing metaphysical commitments may not matter so much for a robust and compelling account of attention. Attention, whether between persons or towards a work of art or towards a mouse pad or a tree, may fruitfully be thought of not as including empathy as one of its instances, but rather with empathy constituting its most exemplary instance. Such an analysis is familiar, fashionable, in certain trends in the philosophy of technology and in what is known as science studies. It owes much to Heidegger and the analysis of the notion of thing as one that derives originally from a social and political usage, whose most accurate definition would be something like object of care or solicitude. On this line of thinking, to relate to a given portion of the external world as a thing is inevitably, in some sense, to anthropomorphize it, or to allow it to occupy a place within a social scheme of values and interests that we do not ordinarily imagine it to have on its own. So I didn't derive my own broad view from such analyses as this, but neither am I choosy about my alliances. Here, as so often elsewhere, I'm taking my cue again principally from Leibniz. Even if Leibniz scholars do not generally put the matter as bluntly as he does, they will, if pressed, to concede that for their philosopher, objects are, first of all, constituted and unified by perceptual activity. And second of all, that if you become aware of an object as a unity, by the same token, you may know that it is in some sense, some degree, perceiving you right back. Now, again, we don't need to share with Leibniz the thoroughgoing metaphysical realism about the unities behind the perceptions in order to appreciate his account of the experience of conscious perception, or as Guattari and others would call it, the experience of attention. If we're prepared to acknowledge with Guattari and Buddhaghosa that it is in fact attention that gives rise to the experience of unity others describe as the self, without there being any such enduring metaphysical unity in the absence of such attention, we might wonder why we should not also admit that this unifying power of attention works both ways and is also what gives rise to the experience of unity of the object. An attender on such an account would experience herself as a unity insofar as she is representing some external object as unified. Another way of putting this is that on such an account, empathy is the paradigm instance of attention that enables us to make sense of all the others. There are at least hints of such a view in Buddhaghosa, though Guattari, being principally interested in human intersubjective attention, mostly passes over them. In a work generally translated as The Dispeller of Delusion, the Buddhist philosopher recommends an ethical technique of, quote, identifying oneself with all, and so taking beings otherwise divided into low, average, or prominent, friendly, hostile, or neutral, and so on, as oneself. Here, the class of non-human entities in question is not human-made artifacts, but presumably plants and animals, unless we take the all with which Buddhaghosa recommends identifying as truly universal in scope. Yet even extending only as far as trees and worms, the philosophy transmits a clear commitment to the possibility and salutariness of cultivating empathetic attention beyond the human realm and into domains where, ordinarily, we suppose we do not have access to what it's like to be the sort of thing being brought into focus. In the exercise of such empathy, it is not that we are literally experiencing embodied comportment to the feelings, commitments, and wishes of inkpots or mousepads, but only that the special power of attention as a mental faculty is to generate the experience of subject, and again, to do so bi-directionally. Bare observation without attention, if such a thing is possible, and I'll stay agnostic on that for today, leaves the observer unchanged, or merely records the presence of the object. Attention opens up the attender to the object, by contrast, so that it may go to work on him or her, bringing her into a changed state, and thus exercising a power we ordinarily restrict to agent others, worthy of a second person stance. Or as the 10th century CE Shaiva philosopher Abhinavagupta, whom Ganeri places in conversation with Buddhaghosa, puts it, whatever manifests itself. I see it's we're coming up on 2 minutes before the hour, and I have one section left, about 2 pages. I'm estimating 10 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Could you there's something that's making like a crackling sound on your mic.
Sorry, that's probably my paper. I'm sorry.
Okay.
All right. Final section. The crisis of attention revisited. Allow me to turn now, in the time remaining, to a consideration of the implications of what has been said so far for our understanding of the present technological situation. In this situation, we have ample illustrations of the ease with which human minds are prepared to attribute subjecthood to automated systems, often in full knowledge that this is what they are. Consider, for example, the 2013 Spike Jonze film, Her, in which a man falls in love with a Siri-like voice command search engine technology. Or at a more mundane level, consider the experiments using AI-based humanoid and animaloid dolls in Japanese rest homes, programmed to say affectionate and reassuring things to the elderly with whom they've been partnered. Researchers have found that the use of such dolls has significant effects in curing or reducing depression. It's not that the residents have been tricked, but only that it was enough, evidently, to encounter a simulation of empathy to experience the positive effects of empathy. There are likewise cases in which subjecthood is projected where it is not, in fact, to be found. These are likewise likely more common in the phenomenology of internet usage, particularly of social media, is the reverse. The presumption that one is interacting with an algorithm when in fact one is or may be dealing with another human being. It has even become a common insult in some corners of the internet to denounce a person with whom you disagree as a bot. The implication is that their opinion is so crude that it may as well have been automatically generated. But it also seems a means of evading any threat of proper engagement with another person's thoughts, any obligation to display moral commitment to the other. The relationship between self and bot, however, may be evolving. I've witnessed over the past few years a new trend among extremely online young people towards setting up bot accounts that mirror their real accounts, perhaps eventually replacing these real accounts. The bot versions of themselves automatically generate novel sentences that are built up from earlier real sentences they have written. In time, we might expect the moral character, or perhaps merely the coolness or popularity of people will be judged not on anything they actually say, but on the character of the bots that shadow or echo them. In 2040, we might check in on how our digital personae are doing in the same way we periodically check our stocks. Just as we now monitor our passive income, we may someday soon do the same for our passive selves. Perhaps these selves too will be assigned a social credit rating, whether called by that or some other name, to which we can appeal, or which we will seek to conceal when we are maneuvering for a new job, say. In much online interaction, it's plain that the question whether the cause of what is happening on our screen is a real human or a bot is quite beside the point. We know that political polarization and the spread of conspiracy theories in recent years has been greatly enhanced, exacerbated by the incentives built into social media, where a subtle, nuanced, hesitant observation is likely to get you hundreds of times fewer likes and retweets than a bold observation is like, than a bold declaration of partisanship. We also know that many who get pulled into the dynamics of like-seeking do not, to say the least, experience their online activity as a Turing test. That is, automated engagement with partisan posts will do just as well as human engagement. Both trigger the dopamine system equally well, and even if one might have some lingering doubt as to the ontological status of the being or the code behind the like one has just received, it is preferable, or rather more conducive to pleasure, to bracket that doubt as best as one is able. Now, these examples, which could be multiplied indefinitely, reveal a communication landscape often bereft of the possibility of reciprocal moral interpenetration, which is another way of saying, along the lines I've already spelled out, that the internet is hostile to properly empathetic encounters. The same internet, of course, if it could take human form and speak in a unified voice, would deny such accusations. It would, for example, point to the many apps it offers to help cultivate the practice of mindfulness. Buddhaghosa defines sati, ordinarily translated as mindfulness, as a rehearsal in memory, and elsewhere simply as remembering, thus as attention to things past. As Ganeri notes, what goes by the same name in contemporary culture is in fact of very recent provenance and with little connection to the Indian tradition with which it is imprecisely associated, as it is in fact something more like a fixing on the present moment and thus a variety of concentration, today's mindfulness. One might add that today such concentration is often mobilized in the internet economy for the pursuit of particular professional or profit-oriented goals. Perhaps the most sustained concentration that the internet facilitates is that of coders reviewing their work. But this is precisely work, and its purpose is to weed out mistakes, not to see an object in a new way or to allow one's mind to move down unexpected paths. Attention, we might wish rather to say, cannot involve laborious correction of mistakes in its object, but rather, again, is a matter of moral and cognitive investment in an object or text as being as it is, which in turn opens up the possibility of being transformed by it or understanding abstract principles beyond it or gaining new forms of self-knowledge. So as we've seen, the paradigm instance of such attention in our encounter with other people, an encounter that the internet often at best distorts and at worst positively prevents. While interpersonal encounter is the paradigm case, the aesthetic encounter in turn is also an exemplary instance of attention to the extent that the work of art, seen aesthetically, is on a certain line of thinking ipso facto apprehended as a subject, as I've tried to suggest, capable of moral interpenetration with the person who attends to it. Thus, I skimmed the first volume of In Search of Lost Time, and it seems as if the narrator has his priorities all wrong, that he's self-absorbed and long-winded. I start to imagine the ways I might correct the work, as if it were a string of code and I were a programmer looking to make it run more optimally. Then I read on and I begin to feel myself committing morally to the narrator, which means, among other things, opening myself up to receiving the world as he apprehends it. As this process continues and I sink deeper into the work, I find that that world, Proust's world, is not at all as it first appeared to me. It is not that I now think the narrator is good or correct or praiseworthy, whereas at the beginning, the opposite appellations applied. It's that the moral commitment that I have taken on towards his work, the commitment of attention, has infused his world into mine. The internet, by contrast, seems to be structured so as to positively forbid such an encounter. This might be simply a condition of relative infancy. The great masterpieces of early cinema, after all, such as the Lumiere brothers' 1895 masterpiece, The Waterer Watered, lasted no more than a minute. Roughly 70 years later, we had Andy Warhol's Empire, more than 8 hours long, which, if not a masterpiece, at least is an illustration that, among other things, the cinematic art may sometimes solicit us to undertake marathon exercises of attention that would have been inconceivable in the early years of the technology that made the new art possible. So to conclude, art and literature seem intrinsically constituted so as to demand sustained attention from those who engage with them. It's difficult to imagine taking on Proust's multi-volume magnum opus, for example, without what we might call a deep attentional commitment. Whether we follow through on that commitment or not is another matter. Such a commitment has a moral dimension, if for no other reason than that we know that the sheer amount of time we will have to devote to reading in search of lost time is time taken away from our fellow human beings, and even from other forms of care of ourselves that we might have pursued. It is a big deal to commit to reading, in other words. It's a big deal to attend to a work of art, and it's a big deal to open up oneself to an embodied comportment to the wishes and desires of another person, i.e. Guattari's definition of empathy. If we agree to consider that such transformative moral commitment, whether to another person or to a work of art, or perhaps also to nature, is not only an instance of, but a clavis for understanding attention, then we may in turn consider the following possible account of the present crisis of attention. That it results not from the overabundance in the digital age of possible foci for this mental faculty, as James Williams suggests, but from the excessively narrow channeling of our cognitive and emotional investment down pathways that are structurally guaranteed to limit or prevent personal transformation. Whether this is a temporary limitation of our digital technologies, deriving from the economic model that governs them, or whether it is here to stay, is a question it is too soon to answer, or at least a question for another day. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. As usual, we'll now take a 5-minute break, and then after that, we'll have the Q&A portion or discussion portion. And if you have a question, you should put it in the chat, and then you should put your name in the chat, and then I'll call on people. So you can start thinking about that now, and I will see everyone in 5 minutes.
Yep, see you in 5 minutes.
I guess we're officially back now, and to begin with, there's a question from Honda.
Yeah.
Are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk.
Sure.
So my question is about attention, of course, and like how it's been used in art, especially. So one of the points that you're making is, like we have like this attention crisis, especially like we can see like the way that we use like internet or social media and stuff like that, but also like that kind of has been affecting all like forms of our lives basically. And then you were saying like maybe we can like think about like attention in different ways, like especially the way it's been used in aesthetics, like when we are attending to aesthetic objects. And I thought that like you were especially appealing to a certain sense of, sustained attention when you're attending, you're really attending, you're not just like half-heartedly attending to it. So my question is like, is whether or not actually like if your account is in a certain sense prescriptive. So I'm just like wondering, like if you can expand on it. And I'm not sure if it is prescriptive, are you prescribing it all the time? Like especially for art, because I mean, of course, for the examples that you have you have given, we want the attention be sustained, right? Like you wouldn't really understand Proust if you're skimming through the pages, you know, not paying attention enough. Or like for certain artworks, like that will be the same thing. But I can think of like very different examples, right? Like especially like the Warhol example that you gave. I remember like when I was an undergrad, like taking classes in video production and like watching like 15-hour like film or video of like, I don't know, like the sea, and there's a boat coming and a boat leaving, and that's it. You know, you just like, skim through it, but that was all there is, right? Like there is, and it is just like try to depict like how we understand time and space, like all this stuff, right? Like it's an experimental work, but you do not need to watch like the whole 15, you know, hours in order to appreciate that. You can just like rewind forward, fast forward. And for other artworks, I don't think that we can like attend to everything in an artwork, and it's not even like required. So I'm just like thinking of like especially installation artworks. Ilya Nabokov's, like for instance, The Man Who Flew into the Space from His Apartment. It's like a mess, right? Or like Tracy Emin's bedroom, again, a mess. Or Damien Hirst's works, you know, like cabinets and stuff. You cannot attend to every single object. But every time you can attend to different things, right? So like art, like the demand like that the work makes on us, like in terms of like attention is different. Like so I'm thinking like there is like such a thing, like there is like you can attend in the right way, and that right way doesn't always mean full attention, you know. Even when you're like trying to fully attend, exhaust everything, you're missing the point of the work. So if this is the case, why are we like making the same demand from like internet or from everything else? Do you see, like, can we think about like gradation in terms of attention, or like, or you think of like attention as like something like that we should be always demanding? Like, so I'm just like wondering where your take on this.
So much interesting material to work from there. Thank you very much. And I think it helps me maybe clarify what I'm now thinking of as some of the parts of the paper where I went too fast, and I'm becoming, now that I've presented this for a second time, aware of those parts. Now the idea is, well, if you look at you know, some of the classic work on attention, like William James is the most obvious kind of starting point for a lot of authors working on this. It's the kind of conscious experience he's interested in is, you know, what he likes to call the margins of experience, what it's like to be sitting at your desk and hear a distant siren, but then also realize that the siren has been going since before you started to hear it. What exactly happens at that moment that brings it into your conscious experience? And similarly with things in the visual field. But this is all, you know, this is all just kind of the ordinary flow of experience, the way parts of our experience get selected. And since William James, I think one of the kind of anchoring debates in the philosophy of attention has to do with the relationship of attention to action. That is to say, whether one must always willfully select certain elements within the visual or the aural field and pay attention to them. And I think, you know, that's an interesting kind of wedge once you start thinking about action, because it does already open the door to a more kind of explicitly, overtly, maybe even aggressively moral conception of attention of the sort that I was sketching, where you don't just willfully choose a part of the visual field, but attention in these more elevated cases is a kind of commitment to something that at least takes on the character of another, right? And so that, what I'm now calling more elevated form of attention, is the kind that is, again, more overtly moral. And I think the paradigmatic cases of this can be found in commitment to paying attention to all 12,000 pages of In Search of Lost Time or whatever. That's not to support or refute any of the more kind of mundane kind of constant phenomenological flow of the sort that William James was interested in. It's just to maybe talk about a more interesting paradigmatic case, I think. And I suppose I also wanted to say that I think the last time I tried out this talk, someone said that Proust is a bad choice because so many different considerations come up when we're talking about literature than when we're talking about visual art. For one thing, there's no object there. The object is, as in aesthetic terms, allographic. My version of the novel is not the novel, whereas Tracy Eamon's installation is the installation. So different considerations apply that mean that our notion of attention is different in these different cases. What I like about this example is the obvious serious time commitment that, again, is a moral commitment, if for no other reason than that it's a major life choice to commit to reading this humongous thing, and that's time that you could be investing in others, right? So even if only indirectly, it's a moral choice. But if you focus on visual art, then I think what some people would say, and you see this in certain, say, manifesto-like writing in the vein of art criticism, the way in which people engage with works of art in museums today, or at least until maybe for the better, they were prevented from doing so by the pandemic. If you go to the Louvre, it's ridiculous. You have people being herded past the Mona Lisa while they quickly take a picture of it with their iPhones. And that is obviously something that is that is not, let's say, an experience of attending to a work of art. At a minimum, the experience of attending to a work of art, and you might want to put that in a more highfalutin way and say it's the experience of it as a work of art, is at a minimum an experience that is somehow transformative, or that doesn't leave you the same as when you started to attend to it, right? Even if just in a minimal way. And that could take a fraction of a second. It typically takes more time, right? So I'll just leave it at that. But I suppose this is I've talked about these issues with Alexandra at some length a year or so ago. I mean, this is why I, in particular, am so interested in Kant as a philosopher of aesthetics, because of the kind of unity of this project with reflection on the apprehension of nature. And if you look at earlier texts of people like Shaftesbury on aesthetic experience, paradigmatically, it's experience of nature, right? Of the veins in a leaf or something like that. And paradigmatically as well, what's distinctive about that kind of experience is that it's potentially infinite. That is to say, you could stare at a single leaf forever and never come to the end of the discovery of new details that escaped your attention before, right? So different, again, different domains, different genres of art, but also art and nature respectively bring up different questions, but they all, I think, help us to elicit what we're talking about when we're talking about attention.
Okay, there's a question from Dustin.
Yeah. Hi, Dustin.
Thank you. And apologies again for missing your talk. I had to lead the discussion. I find what you've written here really fascinating. It relates a lot to my research, so I thought I would chime in a bit. And some other authors have brought up a lot to do with specifically our attention online. Juan Pablo Bermudez identifies the correlation with, though not a necessary connection, because there just hasn't been enough time to do this research since Web 2.0, but basically a correlation with weakened academic performance. And then Clinton Castro and Adam Pham wrote a paper about where they kind of suggest that this attention economy is noxious or toxic, citing that it can create weakened cognitive ability and it exploits person's vulnerability in many ways.
Yeah.
Their kind of suggestion at the end, or recommendations, are kind of two-part. One is pretty strong in that they say maybe we should actually require social media companies or game developers like to put warning labels on their sites saying, hey, explicitly, what is it? The Department of Health and Human Resources and Services has determined that excessive screen time is dangerous to your mental health. Kind of like you see on cigarette packs, The other more diplomatic approach is to kind of like strongly suggest to these companies that they implement some kind of self-regulation, whatever. We've seen this with the Facebook and stuff, but do you think either of these is an actual option, like in an applied ethic manner, to kind of like work with this problem? And should we take a more diplomatic approach, or should there be step in and tell you how to do your job kind of like approach?
Oh man, I guess one thing I didn't mention is I have a book coming out later this year called called The Internet Is Not What You Think It Is. It's informed by some of my work on Leibniz's reckoning engine and the history of telecommunications, like the early history, like in the 17th century. It's mostly a kind of HPS oriented book, though I've been under a lot of pressure to speak more to the contemporary moment and, let's say, to questions surrounding the extraction economy of attention, the specter of surveillance capitalism, and these issues. I can say what I really think, kind of in a gut way, as a non-specialist. But I'm inclined to believe that social media should be seized and transformed into a public utility, and should be governed by direct democratic oversight rather than being in the hands of private companies. And it's only if that happens that that they're ever going to be anything other than fundamentally structured for the purpose of addiction. And short of that, I don't think that's going to happen. And I can certainly see the downside of that too. There will probably be in the coming years some kind of gradual kind of running together of certain public utility like functions with what these private companies are always doing. That is to say, our social identity will be more officially anchored to some kind of online avatar. And some of this service might be provided by the already existing companies. It could, involve blockchain technology and so on. But I don't know what's going to happen, but I know that they're going to keep trying to keep people as addicted as possible in order to keep extracting as much data as possible for as long as they can, because that's how private companies operate. And so the problem is economic, and I don't know how to fix it other than by seizing them. Or by smashing this economic system, but that's not really, a philosophical commitment of mine. That's just what I think. What I do hope, though, and what I try to explain in this book, is that I think there's some utility rather than jumping to proposals for a solution to this huge problem. There's some benefit, some incremental benefit to kind of deeply historically informed philosophical reflection on what the nature of this thing is, in a way that can help us to understand the nature of the current problem better. Now, I'm also, and I'll just say one more word about this, and then because I want to get to other questions as well. I am interested in the work of a fellow French scholar. His name is Yves Citon, who has written a lot on what he calls the ecology of attention. And Yves is someone who really does not like the James Williams, not William James, but James Williams style account, according to which the problem is that the kind of overabundance of stimuli leads to attention scarcity. I think Yves rightly says that this is just, effectively an old geezer worry. Like, it's old people are wary of new technologies and they think they're frying the kids' brains. And we need not to see it like that. Rather, the problem is again, just the economic model and the fact that, as he, I think, compellingly puts it, the principal industry that has risen up is one that is literally an extraction economy. Right? That is to say, it's extracting a resource from the people who are using it, and that's why it's free and so on. But what needs to be done is not to, kind of discipline ourselves or something like that, but just we need to be more critical and more aware. And in any case, on an evolutionary scale, not nearly enough time has passed for this to really fry our brains, right? Our brains are more, let's say, more kind of resilient than that in the end. I'm inclined to think. Yeah, Alexandra.
Whoops. Thank you for coming to this, timeless, spaceless apparently meeting of
Yeah.
ours. Yeah, it's great to have you, and your talk's super interesting as always. Yeah, so I guess I would just have like a piggyback question about like the positive prescription of like, sure, like we accept all of this, like there definitely is a crisis and a tension, and what do we do now? And I also accept the idea that it has not to do with like information overload, but it has something to do with like the narrowness of our pathways. Sort of, but I guess I have like a sort of like a follow-up on that, and like piggybacked with like, okay, what does this mean? Like what ought we do as a society or as an individual? Because in some ways, like I think the kind of prescription to like meditate or be mindful or like stare at a leaf for an entire day is probably a good one. But on the other end, I'm like, okay, that's a narrow pathway in its own right? Like the more like kind of the traditional techniques of cultivating awareness are very, very narrow in some senses, or like, I picture Zen practitioners like staring at blank gray concrete walls for years on end or something like that. So in a way, there's like something very narrow and not like that isn't like very engaged with others in some way, but like sort of like the exemplar of attention. And then like, okay, so, and then bringing this to like, okay, modern society, I'm the kind of person who like isn't involved in social media. And, a lot of times I think like I'm proud of myself for it, sort of, like I'm not on Facebook or Twitter, any of these things often, but I'm also sort of like disconnected with the world if I'm not. So like in some ways, like I've narrowed my own pathways to like engage with others with empathy. So maybe I'm better at staring at the blank wall thing, but then I'm not, like, so I guess this isn't really like a great, like super clear question, but.
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of, like the kind of the cluster of worries that you're expressing all have to do with like, what is to be done? How ought I to live? Or something like that in the face of this. And what's certain here, and I'm kind of echoing what I already said to Dustin, is that there's this vein of popular literature, people like Jaron Lanier, the virtual reality pioneer who then kind of dropped out of the tech world altogether and writes popular books like, 10 Reasons to Delete Your Social Media Account Now. I mean, that's just, I'm sorry, but that stuff is just silly, because it doesn't matter if you're on social media or not. You're living in a world that is structured by social media style algorithms, right? So you're not free to opt out unless you are really, really, really going off the grid. And kind of passing down of responsibility to the individual for shutting off your social or closing your social media accounts or whatever is, I think, a ruse and a trick, and it's very much of a pair with the other forms of passing down of major political crises to individual consumers, like recycling aluminum cans or whatever, when obviously the more urgent thing to do is to attribute responsibility where it actually lies, right? Which is not with consumers. So what does one do? I don't know. I mean, this is, I'm again just kind of reflecting here, but one thing that strikes me is I personally experience the internet as a kind of superpower cerebral prosthetic. And there are so many things like, 15, 20 years ago, if I were sitting around at home and I thought, what is a quasar anyway? Or how thick is the mantle of the earth or something like that? 15 or 20 years ago, I would have wondered these things and I would have just immediately dropped the thought. I would have thought, I'll figure it out someday, or someone will tell me someday. Next time I talk to Abe, I might ask him what a quasar is, if I remember. But today, I immediately turn to my brain prosthetic, which is Wikipedia, and I know so much more than I would have otherwise. It is like, it's galaxy brain in another sense. And that is an experience that has to do with, what my earlier desires were, the way I came up in the world before the internet. And it doesn't seem, this is just anecdotal, but this kind of expansion of the kind of encyclopedic power of the brain doesn't seem to be the usual effect of this universal access to this infinite encyclopedia, right? Somehow people know as little as they ever did about things like what quasars are and so on. And so all of this is to say that in terms of what is to be done, this is just such an individual question of individual comportment and habits and so on, that I can't really speak to it beyond that.
Okay, I have a question if no one else does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, okay, so there's a couple things, one of which leads into the others. So the first thing, which is perhaps, I don't know if it's less important, but less philosophical maybe, is that I don't know how much you know about the history of Usenet, but so, in a sense, all social media and forums and all kinds of things like that we have now are descended from Usenet.
Yeah.
Usenet was a public utility, basically, right? The whole internet was.
Yeah.
Government run, and actually commercial use was prohibited.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet Usenet was addictive, was tended towards political extremism, resulted in escalating insults in every discussion. And I guess the first person who was accused of being a bot was this, well, I assume real person, I don't know, Serdar Argic was a kind of fanatical Turkish poster who, anytime anyone mentioned something having to do with Armenia or Armenians, would, so, and so, like, first of all, that's something to think about generally, but second of all, it leads me to think, what is it that there's something about a certain kind of online interaction, or even just an interaction with a computer in general, that that causes these effects that may be independent of economic model or anything else. And one of the things, this is that now I'm moving to the second thing, which is kind of more philosophical. So when I was discussing with the grad students, someone mentioned, oh yeah, this made me think about Levinas. And, in that context, you might think to yourself, well, somehow, like when you interact with someone through these media, there's no face. And the reason that really raises all kinds of interesting questions about what you're talking about is that I think Levinas, if you said to him, the paradigmatic case of attention to the objects around us that we use and whatever is empathy, would say that that's exactly why empathy is not the case where we actually encounter another, right? That the metaphysical distance is missing there because we are regarding them as of the same make and model as ourselves. And that's also why our working from home in that case, like being at home, is also incomplete, and there is no subject there. There's just a frame of attention.
Yeah.
Because, when we're interacting with others in that way, we're not separated from them in a way that allow us to be ourselves.
Yeah.
So in other words, it seems like this way of thinking about it might lead to an almost, in some sense, opposite diagnosis of what's wrong here. That the problem is when I sit at home with my computer and encounter someone that way, as opposed to sitting in that opening of my tent, and three random people come, and maybe they're angels. And I have no commitment to them.
Yeah.
And yet I have to run and, find some way of hospitality.
Yeah.
That's what's missing.
Yeah.
So I guess there isn't really a question here as much as, what's your reaction to that?
Well, it's so, it's interesting, isn't it? I've thought a lot about Levinas and the face, because I've been doing in this course I did last semester on attention. We talked a lot about some cognitive science research that deals with the face recognition module of the brain, and the way certain cerebral lesions can make it hard to apprehend faces and things like that, and also the way in which our kind of highly developed facial recognition capacity is what pushes us to perceive pareidolia in clouds and electrical sockets and things like that. And this is a great example of what Dennett's hyperactive intentionality detection device of the brain. You're like constantly rushing to perceive faces where they are not, right? Because you want a subject, or your brain wants to see subjects all around you, or at beings capable of intentions, right? Certainly Levinas is exploring what cognitive science and neuroscience tell us using other tools. But I think in the phenomenological tradition, and I'm certainly, even though I'm based in Paris, I'm not really well positioned to speak for the phenomenological tradition. But when you read people like Merleau-Ponty or Sartre, there is a preoccupation with, let's say, second-person experiences that need not necessarily involve face-to-face interaction, or where the face is concealed, or Sartre is interested in being looked at from behind and getting a kind of weird sensation from that somehow, where the person might be behind a mask or behind a tree. So in that sense, faciality is not kind of ineliminable part of this profound second person experience that the phenomenologists are interested in. So in that respect, then, there are some, you get home and you see your spouse has left you a note or something like that. That too is that can be a profound interpersonal experience. Like, oh, there's a note for me. You know, all sorts of possible scenarios in which you're having mediated interpersonal experience. And I take it that that the Zoom era is just continuing those kinds of experience, and it's giving us a sort of face, or anyhow, you know, a virtually mediated face.
Yeah, can I say, I mean, this is like, when I taught a seminar on Levinas a few years back, this was a kind of running argument with some of the grad students, and I'm still not sure what to say. It's like, it's hard to draw the line between metaphor and
Yeah.
literal. Like when he says, you know, war, does he mean literal war? Which, I mean, I think he does, but some of the grad students were saying, well, but, you know, surely it's not just limited to that. It's,
Yeah.
you know, and, you know, so there's the same issue with the face. On the one hand, yes, he means a face,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, is saying there is no face, you know, does it literally mean? It's a question about how we're supposed to approach his written work as well, because
Yeah.
of course his face isn't there, and you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, I mean, that's just to say, I don't know what to say about this either way, but the point that there could, when I say there is no face in this online interaction, on the one hand, yes, there's literally no face, and that seems to be important. But on the other hand, that kind of faceness is kind of trying to say what aspect of ordinary interactions, even with a note or a written, you know, a snail mail letter or whatever, what aspect is missing.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, these are complicated issues. I don't know Levinas that well at all. He's an author I kind of know only by kind of the I don't want to say barely beyond Wikipedia. Oh, and yeah, Usenet. I mean, that is really interesting to think that our usual idea, and the kind of, especially the kind of left anti-capitalist kind of critique that someone like Yves Citon has to offer, the usual idea that it's not the telecommunication or network technology in itself that's turning us into monsters. It's the profit motive that structures our interactions. You could say, well, actually, no, because we have a counterexample. I haven't really thought about that, and that's very interesting, and I need to think about it some more.
Okay, yeah, I need to think about this more too. I also, I mean, need to think more about, maybe this is less important, that about what the experience of coding is actually like, because I don't think what's now called coding, I still think of it as programming, but
yeah.
But yeah, because I don't think it's very much like what you're saying it is, but I don't know how relevant that is to the, it's not like proofreading a paper to find the mistakes.
Yeah. Well, I think the what I wanted to draw out was that you know, if you're looking for applications of attention online, and you know, we talked a little bit about the shock glasses, which is absolutely terrifying, and these kind of cattle prod style technologies that are emerging. The one, I don't know if this is encroached on the UC system yet, but the AI for online test proctoring that monitors your eyeballs, and you know, if it detects something that is algorithmically fishy, not that is probabilistic, that is associated probabilistically with cheating, then it alerts the human beings. So this is, you know, real, true AI surveillance that is, for the moment, only being used to give tests to students, but there's absolutely no reason why it should not become a 24-hour-a-day sort of thing if we aren't militant about it. So why was I talking about that? So the existence of these technologies and the emergence of an idea, of an idea of attention as something that can be monitored by AI, right? And that they're the apps that are used to help people, which is to say goad people or prod people into being productive, are sometimes billed as attention cultivating, right? And this is interesting because that mirrors this kind of strange duality where Silicon Valley types will also talk about their you know, vital stat recording devices, and they even have some of them who are into intermittent fasting will you know, have their blood sugar checked once every 10 minutes, like automatically, by taking a small blood sample and then reading out what their blood sugar is. And this is sometimes articulated in terms of self-knowledge, right? And it's fascinating that that should be called self-knowledge, because in a sense it is, you know, you do learn something about yourself if you know what your blood sugar is, but it certainly is not where the concept of self-knowledge started, right? And so it's the same kind of weird straddling of a boundary between two opposites, between, on the one hand, attention as something algorithmically surveillable, and on the other hand, something that, as I've tried to define it in the talk, can only be understood in terms of the way a person is transformed by the object. And I don't think you know, being a scared public school student who doesn't want to offend the AI counts as being transformed in the ethically suitable way.
No, probably not. I was talking more about the attention of the coder.
Oh, right, yeah. So getting back.
I mean, I guess, I mean, we can talk a little bit longer, but I should,
yeah.
You know, now we're officially over time, so.
Yeah. I just one final thought about that. Yeah. So coding then wouldn't count as attention in my sense, in the sense that you're going through the code and you're looking for bugs, you're looking for things that are wrong. Whereas if you're attending to Venus de Milo or whatever, if you think you're finding errors in Venus de Milo, you haven't yet adopted the proper stance to the thing, right?
Although if you're painting it, I mean, if you're painting it, you're trying to, among other things, and I don't think coding is mostly about looking for bugs, but
you know better than I do, presumably, and it could be that
not that I'm that great at it. Like,
well, it could be that I'm caricaturing the activity, and that it merits some, let's say, a more kind of gentle description from someone who's more inside of it.
It's not so much gentle because there's something deeply
Charitable.
fascinating about it.
Mhm.
It can, you know, and I don't think, you know, and it's in a way that can be counterproductive, actually,
Yeah.
to the thing you're trying to accomplish, right?
Yeah.
Like trying to, like the temptation to refactor your code to make it a more elegant solution, right?
Yeah.
When it's already working. And when you do that, you're going to generate 1,000 new bugs.
Yeah.
But
Right.
So,
Right.
I mean, that's part of the experience, but also part of the experience is like trying over and over to get it to work, or to get it to work better and better, or to add
Yeah.
more feature or whatever.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, you're hungry, you need to use the bathroom, you're tired, you know, but you don't like it like draws you in.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that, I mean, that's not the kind of, it's not the kind of attention you would pay to Proust.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
might
Yeah.
be the kind of attention that you would give to writing if you were Proust. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
anything
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
different from that, as but
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, some authors certainly have a sense of their own proofreading as a kind of correcting objective errors. That's an interesting question. Yeah.
yeah, but like I'm saying, coding is not, I mean, yeah, obviously correcting errors is, I mean, you know, that's part of the experience of it, is that you think you've got it all, you've told the computer what to do.
Yeah.
I've heard that actually, I've never checked up on the sources of this, but I've heard that actually when they first discovered bugs, they were extremely surprised. Like the
Uh-huh.
early people working on ENIAC or whatever, you know,
Yeah.
they're like, okay, we'll tell it what to do to solve the differential equation. And it did something
Oh,
different. And they're like, wait, we told it what to do. Why is it?
yeah.
But anyway, right? Like the experience of you've got it all down, you've told it what to do, and then you run it and it, you know, crashes.
Wait, is that
That is
because
part of it, but
is that because they were thinking too much on analogy to human problem solving processes, and they assumed that if the machine arrived at an error, it would be like, oh, but here's what I'm really supposed to do. I can ignore that. Like in the same way that if you're, you know, solving arithmetic problems in a book and you see, I don't know, an E instead of a 3, you can be like, oh, that's supposed to be a 3 or something.
no, I think it's because they didn't realize how hard it is to give instructions
Uh-huh.
precisely.
Yeah. Well, but
Uh,
it's like, but it would seem that it's like there's almost this, yeah, difficulty in really bearing in mind how totally stupid a machine actually is, you know, unless you tell it
yeah,
absolutely what it needs to do.
it doesn't usually happen that way, though.
Uh,
It's usually, yeah, it's harder to explain the way it goes wrong, but it's not usually that you assume that a machine will really understand what you mean and fill in the gaps or something like that.
Yeah, I see. I see.
It's that, you know, you just don't realize that
Mm,
that wasn't the right test to put on that loop, that it should
right,
have been
right.
greater than or equal to, or, you know, because
Yeah.
like you forgot about a case that's going to come up, or, you know, you didn't realize that sometimes when the code reaches this point, a certain variable won't have been defined yet, or, you know, something like that.
Right,
It's
right,
just,
right, right.
it's just like the magnitude of planning in advance how a certain
Yeah,
task is going to be done step by step
right.
is actually, that's actually much more difficult than before you start trying to do it, you would realize.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I'm sorry, I feel like maybe I'm keeping people here.
Well, my day's over anyhow. I had a great time talking to you all.
My day is just beginning, even though it's noon. But I mean, it is in the sense of I haven't got to the things I need to do yet. But yeah, so I guess we'll end here. But
Okay.
thanks so much for coming. And
Yeah.
you know, we should continue this conversation by some
Yeah.
medium or other.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Let's do it. Yeah. Yeah. Great to see
Okay.
you again, Abe. Great to see you as well, Alexandra. And nice to meet some of you for the first time. And thank you for coming to my talk.
Okay. Bye.